Hello and welcome to my software process interview series here with another special guest. This is actually the twin of my girlfriend, David, who is a friend of mine and also a software engineer and who worked at a interesting software company called NuoDB that was building a database system, which is interesting because it's a little different than a lot of software systems I've worked on, where it's totally fine if you lose some data here and there, as long as if someone asks about it, you can find it somewhere or make it up if you can't find it or just say you're sorry. But with certain types of databases, especially if someone important is using them, you can't really let things slide like that. And so I'm interested to see how that affects the software processes that were followed at NuoDB. So that's what I want to talk about today. But David, maybe you could elaborate a little on what NuoDB was and what you were doing there.
Yeah, definitely. As you mentioned, NuoDB was a database software. So it was a transactional, like SQL compliant, ACID compliant distributed database. And so mostly OLTP kind of workloads, and various customers were financial institutions, other companies kind of using it as like the core base truth. So it's kind of a mission critical part of people's system. Basically, how development worked at NuoDB at a high level was there was a SQL group that did everything relating to SQL, so like query optimizations, all that kind of stuff. And then underneath it, there was a group we called the platform group, or the platform layer. And basically that did everything for like storage, replication, backups, how actual transactions were managed, basically everything that kind of like was the foundation for the SQL layer on top. And so I worked for that platform layer.
Yeah, and what kind of role were you playing for that team?
Yeah, so I was a software engineer for that team. It was a fairly small team, somewhere between like 5 to 8 people throughout my time there. And pretty flat organization structure. We all kind of we had like a team lead who kind of ran and managed the team, but then the rest of us were just software engineers underneath him.
Yeah, very cool. All right, let's like make a little diagram.
Yeah.
Sure, I can share my screen with you. Can you see this diagram?
Yeah.
Excellent. So let's start. So I want to start with some customer request has come down the pipeline and has been prioritized to be done. So I guess I'll say customer request. I guess start pretty open-ended. What happens next in your mind?
Yeah. So it kind of depended specifically on like what the customer request was. So generally, kind of more abstract or less urgent requests would kind of be accumulated either by like sales engineers or people who are interfacing with the customer, and they would kind of be accumulated, and we would kind of have like a roadmap of kind of a wish list. So like the roadmap with a bunch of things, not all of which we could do, but kind of like things that seemed like they'd be a good idea for the business. And then usually at the start, so NuoDB released on like a 6-month kind of cycle. So maybe somewhat different than a lot of like software today is, we did do continuous integration kind of as we were developing, but the actual like stuff that was going out to customers was, it was on like a discrete, like kind of longer release cycle. And so basically at the start of each cycle, we'd look at the backlog or like the wish list and figure out kind of what made sense, balancing kind of business requirements, and then also like what we could feasibly do with the headcount and kind of like what we were set up to do based on like where the tech was in the actual development of other stuff. So that was kind of generally how things got decided upon, especially earlier when we were like more of a smaller startup, like scrappy startup. There were some kind of customer requests that came in and kind of like immediately got prioritized just because it was like a large account that absolutely needed a feature in order for like the sales process to go forward, something like that. But generally, especially as time went on, the product matured a little bit. It would go into this kind of like wish list, and then the engineers would work with kind of like product management to figure out, okay, like what is the priority of each thing, and then how like feasible is it for us to do it. And kind of like the way the engineering would give feedback is we'd usually like size things in terms of like, this is a small task, medium, large, extra large, to give like a rough sense. And then later down the line, we'd kind of like, put some actual numbers on it. Like, we think this will take 2 engineers 6 months to do it or whatever. And then that would give like product management the information they needed to figure out, okay, like this is how many things we can actually fit. Like what puzzle pieces do we want to put together?
All right, you just gave me a lot of stuff.
Yeah, sorry, that was kind of a spiel.
Yeah, no, it's fine. But let me just make sure that I'm getting it down properly. So we have the customer request, right? It comes in. The first question is this customer request super urgent? Do we need it to close a large account right now? If
Yeah.
the answer is yes, you just stick it straight into the 6-month release cycle.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So then if not, we go into the backlog/wish list. And we have this estimation that's performed by engineers, which feeds into this prioritization by product managers. And then they just decide what goes. Is this sort of what we're looking at?
Yeah, and then they generally decide what goes in, or they kind of have the final say. Yeah. There was like
go
yeah.
ahead.
I was gonna say there was sometimes where we would kind of purposely leave room in the next, so for whatever was doing the next cycle, if there was something that we knew we needed to like do, like something that would take more than 6 months that we needed to start working on, we would like leave room and work with product managers to make sure there was room to kind of like set the foundation for something in a later cycle. But again, that was still kind of like a collaborative process with the product managers to figure out if that made sense. Yeah. And I guess the one other thing I'd add to this, kind of like to this diagram, is like for things that were really urgent, like for example, if we had like a bad customer bug, like a customer is reporting some sort of critical issue, we did do kind of like point releases that we could release more frequently than like every 6 months, like basically non-feature releases. And so sometimes if there was like a really high priority bug, we would like make that our top priority and then get it out in some sort of like earlier release vehicle than like the normal feature release. So
Why did you decide on a 6-month release cycle?
it just kind of seemed like a good compromise between delivering some features to the customers at a regular cadence and still giving us time to actually make headway on stuff that takes a while to like update, or like a while to implement. Kind of another complicating thing that was always in the back of our minds that made it hard was NuiDB could be upgraded online in a rolling fashion, and so anything that was like a protocol change or whatever had to be backwards compatible. And to add even further complexity to that, basically, if something was rolling upgraded to a new protocol, then it couldn't easily be rolled back. Like we didn't design stuff to be able to be rolled back and forth, and so stuff that required new protocols um, basically had to only go into certain releases where the customer was like willing to basically do a major upgrade, because it was not something where they could just upgrade and then decide to go back. And so the 6 month window seemed like a kind of something that worked well for our customers to basically give them like this is going to be a major upgrade kind of step every 6 months or so. Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah, so I didn't
Yeah.
actually want to talk about the release process right yet, but I brought it on myself because I asked about why the release cadence was 6 months. Um, so, so wow, the rollback was impossible. Is that really what you're telling me?
Yeah, basically. So for smaller releases, for like those point releases or whatever, you could definitely downgrade back. But for example, like there were some times where in order to accomplish a certain feature, we needed to add a field to the data or whatever, um, like to the data that we stored on disk. Then if you wanted to go back, there was no clean way to uh, kind of like reverse. You are storing stuff in a different way. Your either like wire representation or your on disk representation has changed in some sort of way, and so it was basically there was a lot of complexity in allowing it even to roll forwards online, and so we didn't attempt to make it like reversible because that would have really really slowed a lot of development of features. So um, yeah.
And did I hear correctly that you said that the customers had like veto power over major releases? Did you say that?
No, no, I don't.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
But
Sorry
you
if I
said
made it seem
something
that way.
you made it seem something like the customers needed to be okay getting a major upgrade, but maybe I just
Oh,
misheard that.
yeah, yeah. Basically, like if yeah, if we like so the since the upgrades were kind of like a fairly big process, we basically needed the customers to like be on board with that, and so they needed to be uh, basically that we needed to balance getting them the features they wanted without inconveniencing them too much with like a major upgrade. And so like we would put some things into smaller releases that we could, but for like major features and stuff, usually it meant some sort of like protocol change, which basically meant no going backwards. And so at that point, had to work closely with customers to make sure that like it was coming at a cadence that they could handle. Um, and then also basically making sure that we didn't get too many like version streams going at the same time. So we would like maintain a couple of different version streams, so like the newest and greatest, and then we'd like put fixes in the older ones, and so customers had some flexibility, but again, with being a fairly small company, we weren't like Microsoft maintaining 30 years of backwards compatibility or whatever. So the customers would have 6 months or a year of older releases that they could stay on, and then at some point they would have to upgrade because we were depreciating like whatever stream they were on, and they had to like roll forwards onto a newer version.
And when they did these major upgrades, would there be downtime?
No, so that was the whole complexity, but the whole reason there was complexity, but also benefit was that it was all done online, and so basically they would start up nodes running the new software. Those nodes could operate at the old software, basically using the old protocols. But then once every single node was running the newer software, the new protocol would start to be used, and like new features would become enabled, and that would all happen online.
Cool. Okay. All right. Let's back up a little bit. I
Yeah,
do
sorry.
want to. No, this is great. This is great, but we're not there quite yet. But this will be useful later. Um, but okay. So I would say this is sort of like a 6 month sprint almost. I would say it seems like. Okay,
Yeah,
cool. Let's call it a sprint
yeah,
because we stick work in the sprint, but we don't really
yeah,
stick work into the release cycle.
y-
Um,
yeah. Yeah, we
So
did
what?
use like we structured stuff. You might have been going here, but we structured stuff inside like a 2 week, what we called a sprint. So like worked on stuff in 2 week kind of chunks. Um, but we can definitely call it like something else um, as well.
Um, sure, we can just call it 6 month release. Whatever makes sense. Oh no, spring. Okay. So once you know what you want to do in this 6 month period, what's the next step?
Yeah, so usually it would be like figuring out the design would come first, especially for like any larger feature. And so generally would put some person in charge of um, writing up a design document outlining like kind of exactly how things would work at a high level and even at kind of like a medium level. Um, and then, so yeah, that was usually your first step if the design was needed. Um, there were some things, that were small enough that they, could be done without a design, but most like feature stuff, uh, was like needed a design. The stuff that didn't need a design was usually like some sort of bug that wasn't critical enough that we'd like, just rush it out into its own, like, point release, but that like customers have been kind of like hitting and had an annoyance with, and sometimes like those kind of bugs, would just be solved, as an individual task without kind of any planning component to it. Um, but for like most of the actual features, yeah, there was a, a design phase, and usually it would sit in the design phase for a while while like the team reviewed and critiqued the design and kind of got consensus on it. Um,
Yeah,
so
tell me about the review process.
yeah, so I mean, usually because it was a small enough team, everyone would end up taking a look at the review or the design and adding a little bit of their opinion. Um, but generally, there was like one or two people, other than the person who wrote it, who were kind of like most knowledgeable about that area. So generally, like the most knowledgeable person would write up the design, but then like the second and third most knowledgeable people would review it, and then we'd also have like a sign off by a product manager and a a sign off from someone on the QA team, basically. So that way they made sure there was eyes on that, and we weren't like mistaking, like getting the wrong requirements or coming up with something that QA was going to have no ability to validate, things like that. Um, and in terms of the actual like format of this, we use like a wiki. It was Confluence, like one of the Atlassian products, but basically it was like someone would write up a big page, and then people could like leave comments on various sentences or leave high level comments at the end, and then the wiki page would get kind of updated as the design honed in on the final solution.
Nice. Yeah, sounds legit. Yeah, and then what happens next?
Yeah, so generally at that point, usually the person who wrote the design, once it was agreed on, would like break up the work into kind of like concrete tasks. And so we usually use like Jira tasks for this, but like basically create. And usually it'd be like one of two things. So usually there would either be um, like a some sort of task. We often call them like spikes, but basically like further investigate like this one piece of it. Like, okay, like I know we want to write it to disk, but how exactly do we want it to write it to disk, kind of thing, or something like that, where there's still a little bit of further research needed. And then there was also like like just development work, and that was kind of like the two components that would come out of it is usually like further research into this area, and then yeah, development work. And we'd usually use like the Jira had like the ability to kind of like link uh, like Jiras together. So you could say like this Jira depends on this Jira, or this one has to be done first, or this one blocks this one. And so we generally use like that kind of structuring in order to like lay it out so you could kind of figure out what pieces had to be done in what order. and usually we'd put all those Jiras. I don't know how familiar you are with Jira. So some of this stuff like probably has different names in different tracking softwares, but we create like an epic, which is just like a bucket of related Jiras, and we usually create an epic that captured all the work to implement the feature. And the goal would basically be by the time we did code freeze in order to do the release, like that all the tasks in that epic were done. Was that kind of the goal?
And then we stick it in the sprint.
Yeah, and so basically every 2 weeks we'd do like a sprint planning. So we'd basically see what had been done the previous sprint, and then we'd see what we basically like see what we could fit into the upcoming sprint. And so we usually we'd have a couple different feature buckets or epics that we were drawing upon, and so we'd draw in as many or issues like tasks from each bucket as we think we could fit into the 2 week sprint, and then work on those for 2 weeks and then kind of reassess after 2 weeks. And so we weren't. I know like some companies use like for agile, it's kind of like everything is kind of releasable at the end of your sprint in some form, or like you have some sort of POC or some concrete thing. And we didn't really stick to that in large part just because some of the features, it's like you would do, I don't know, 3 months of background work where it wasn't really something that you could like demonstrate working before you could actually put the stuff in that started to like make it a usable feature. And so generally some tasks would bleed across sprints and stuff. So it was less of like a hard boundary than maybe some companies do, and more of like just a chance to check in and reassess how things were going every 2 weeks and adapt as needed.
Did you have like retrospectives then?
Kind of. We at one point were doing like kind of like formal retrospectives. We kind of drifted away from that, but there was, it was like a chance to talk about, be a little retrospective on like how things were going and be like, okay, like, do we need to bubble up to product management that this is like, we've hit something unexpected, or we think this is going to take longer than we originally thought, or this is going to prevent us from doing some other task, things like that. So that was usually a time when we would kind of communicate that.
Just
we also
during
did, I don't know if
sprint
you,
planning?
so we also like did daily stand-ups, like just as status updates, and things could definitely be raised then. Like for example, if there was like some issue you just discovered with the work you're trying to do, you definitely could bring that up. But I would say like the daily stand-ups were more time to like reassess the tasks within the sprint, and then the sprint was like a sprint planning was a good time to be like, okay, are we like falling off schedule for implementing this feature or like something like that. Yeah. And
Nice. Cool.
our daily stand-ups were usually like pretty short and concise. They would generally be like 10, 15 minutes at most. Whereas like sprint planning, we'd allow like, I don't know, hour and a half to plan. Yeah. And the one other thing, I don't know like if it fits into the document here, but also during sprint planning, we would use that as a chance to kind of like review any bugs that have been coming in. And so like, and triage, or like at least do like maybe not a triage of the actual issue, but like figure out if there anything that looked urgent that maybe we had missed, like wasn't urgent enough to like get a call in the middle of the night kind of thing, but like had gotten filed by someone and needed to be looked at in the upcoming week or two. So we'd do like a high level kind of bug triage then too. And that would obviously affect the amount of work we could put into the sprint.
Yeah, totally makes sense. All right, we got to keep moving forward though. It's in the sprint
Cool.
now. What happens next?
Yeah, so the within a sprint, it was usually like a lot of flexibility in terms of like how you worked on the tasks you had in your sprint. Especially like there would be some times when you'd be waiting for information on a bug or something, and so you start working on something else. So within the sprints, it was kind of like work on things in like whatever order and cadence makes sense. Yeah, in terms of, should I go into like how we actually like, like what our development process look like now, or um, were you?
Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure. I think that's fine.
yeah, yeah. So I guess, yeah, most, I'd say like probably because we were such a small team, most like work happened like there was collaboration around design and stuff, but most of like the actual coding was done like individually. Um, and so usually with like develop um, write code for whatever like subtask you were trying to work on, and then we did like some there's like a mandatory code review uh, process before like you could actually push it to wherever you wanted it to go. So yeah, let's see. In terms of the actual like code review process, I mean I don't have a ton of other experience, but it was definitely like I would say like fairly rigorous. It was definitely not a culture of like just just like skim over it and sign off because like there needed to be a reviewer. I mean for like very very small bug fixes sometimes like if there's like a one line fix or something like that you just like glance at it and mark complete. But usually people spent a good amount of time on reviews, and things would spend a while in review before they actually were committed. So I don't know particular numbers, but it was not uncommon for like the review software to show 10 plus hours of time spent between everyone on like discussing on the review. And sometimes things would sit in review for even a couple weeks. Well, stuff was iteratively fixed on it. So it was definitely like maybe a little bit more of a collaborative process than like maybe your standard like pull. I don't know. I guess it depends a lot company by company, but it was not just like a sign off. It's good to go. Like push it. It was usually like things would like cycle through um, the review for a while. It was kind of like if you like are on a mailing list and you see like a patch being worked on for like the Linux or for I don't know any kind of open source thing, how it can bounce around, kind of getting feedback for a while. Our code review process was kind of like that, where things wouldn't necessarily like immediately move through. Um, yeah, and the
So
expectation
would
too when
it
we
be
schedule. Oh, go ahead.
would it be implicitly assigned to everyone, or how would you decide sort of like who was
Uh,
most in charge of reviewing? Or,
yeah, so you would kind of you'd assign usually one or two people who were like the closest, like who had the most relevant knowledge to be like the actual reviewers, and so they had to like sign off before it was pushed. But usually, so the reviews were visible by everyone. Anyone could add themselves as a reviewer if they felt like they actually wanted to have veto power as well. Um, and then usually if there's like an important code review, uh, would send it out to like would send an email out to the team, just like giving everyone a heads up. Like you could go through and browse current code reviews, but usually if there was like a kind of critical one, I would assign like a couple people who were kind of the experts, and then notify the rest of the team saying, hey, I just put out a review for this. If you're interested, like please take a look. Like, and then people would hop on, and it was pretty common for people to like even if they weren't a primary reviewer doing like a detailed review of the entire change, they would like look at something that they had knowledge of, or like nitpick around the edges on something. So yeah, and sometimes there was just kind of like complete the flow. There was definitely some times where things would go to code review, and then via design, like via enough discussion, there was kind of the decision that like we needed to go step back and go back to like a higher level design because there wasn't fundamental agreement about stuff outside of just like how it was implemented. And so sometimes it would end up with like going and writing a new design doc, or just updating an existing one or something like that. Yeah. So
yeah, yeah, that definitely can happen. Makes sense.
uh,
Yeah, when you get too many comments, sometimes you gotta break down and write some kind of document. Uh,
yep, totally.
just give, just give up. All right, fine. I'll
Yep,
write the document.
yep, yeah.
Yeah, it
So
seems like It seems like things could get kind of stuck where you would have like 10 tasks in process, but they would all just be in review, and you kind of didn't really want
Yeah,
to start anything else. Did that happen a lot, or?
that was definitely, yeah, I'd say like one kind of issue. I think like in part because there was like such a, you know, critical, like correctness was really important for the system. We kind of like leaned heavily into the direction of like slower but safer is better. But that definitely, there was kind of the issue where, you know, you would have like your two tasks for the week were just like stuck in like review, and there was just like comments coming in from everything, and you were trying to get consensus, and then you feel like you don't really have the bandwidth to take on anything big because your most of your mental focus is like kind of shepherding it through the review process. And so because of that, you know, you probably could fit in a little bit of work, but like you don't have that work to do, and so you know, you're not at maximum efficiency because you're spending so much bandwidth trying to like keep the review process moving along. Yeah. So yeah,
Yeah,
I'd say that's an accurate insight.
yeah, that makes sense. Are we ready to release at this point? Are there more steps?
Yeah, so I guess yeah. So once it's in code review, yeah, I guess I'll bridge from there to the release. So once it's in code review and gets signed off on by like whoever the reviewers are, um, then it would get pushed into, at the very least, into like the master branch. And so basically, the master branch was wherever basically the, the master branch was what was under current development and what the next major release would be created from. Um, and then we've had other branches that were like release branches that represented older release streams. Um, and then sometimes we tried to avoid a ton of integration branches, but if it was like, you know, a big collaborative effort where things were going to be like really messy for an extended period of time, we would like use a integration branch before pushing everything into master at once. But generally, uh, you know, we avoided like breaking master. Like you didn't want to break other features, but we generally were okay with, you know, pushing stuff into master even if it wasn't like feature complete. If you had like some kind of atomic chunk that was ready to go in. Um, so and so basically when you push to master, usually for like features and stuff, it would only live in master. For bug fixes was much more common. You would also like backport it onto older release branches as far as it made sense back. Sometimes that was trivial. Sometimes there was like some actual backporting work to figure out exactly how to make it work with whatever the older version of the software was doing. But yeah, so that's kind of how it would get pushed in. And then basically we had so I guess I should have said before it was actually pushed to master, we had like some kind of a integration test framework that ran, I don't know, like a couple hours of tests that you could run on your change to make sure it didn't break anything obvious. And so you would run that and basically just like double check your work. And then basically on master we had larger, like some nightly tests and stuff running, that, you know, sometimes, usually it was pretty rare that you'd have to revert something, but sometimes you'd push something, you'd think it was okay based on the integration test, and then you'd wait, and the next day you'd see that like the longer form test had uncovered something, and, you know, maybe you'd have to revert. Usually that wasn't the case, but those nightly tests would offer like a, you know, kind of a backstop for that. And then kind of as we were getting closer to like being feature complete and all of that, the QA team would start to do their own testing of like the feature. And so, you know, we were writing tests as developers, but then they would kind of like double check and write tests at a kind of a larger scale. And so they would start, you know, hammering the new code a little bit and, you know, reporting bugs or whatever, which would then kind of get cycled back in and prioritized to be worked on. So, yeah, there was that. And
So
then
they're probably
I guess
mostly looking for like regressions um, and like the features not working properly. Is that were those the main
yeah,
things?
so like especially like kind of at scale or like with like kind of unusual failure scenarios, like they would spin up 20 nodes in AWS and test the feature like kind of in a real production style setting rather than just like on a laptop or on like a machine or two. So like larger scale testing. And then I guess the only thing before it goes out for release is basically we would do like a code freeze where we it was always a bit of a delicate dance to figure out exactly like the timing for it, but basically like a little bit before the release, like maybe a month before the release, we'd try to be like basically feature complete. Like whatever was going to get into the release was done, and anything else that was clearly not going to make it was like not going to go into the release. And then QA would kind of have like a little bit of time right at the end before the release to do like a final kind of check for like a week or two, and um, and then at that point we could release. And so usually during that check, there would be some stuff that was uncovered, and that would kind of keep the developers busy while that was happening, like tidying up and hardening the release candidate. Yeah, and at some point
Okay.
in that kind of like that freeze is when we'd like branch. So at some point we'd say like, okay, like the code's frozen, it looks good enough, let's branch it into like the latest release branch, and then master would reopen for the future. And if you weren't working on something that was critical for the upcoming release, you could start pushing future work into master at that point. So that's kind of like when the branching would happen and when these like release streams would get created.
Yeah, that sounds really annoying to have to patch your bug fixes into multiple releases, but
Yeah,
yeah,
it
that's how it
it
goes.
definitely was. Yeah, yeah, and for that reason, like I say, we NuDB would try to limit the number of versions it supported, usually to like maybe three, maybe four at most versions at a time. And so usually, and some of the patching would be done as like a kind of with customer specific knowledge. So if only one customer was using that feature and that feature had a bug, then we would only backport as far back as it was needed for that customer. So that also helped limit um, kind of how far back things had to go.
Yeah, yeah, that's reasonable. Um, yeah, that makes sense. Do you think this release little diagram, do you think it still checks out, or is it missing some stuff?
Yeah, no, I'm impressed you managed to keep up and create it on the fly. Yeah, looks good.
Code is ready for release. Incremental rollout with no downtime. Impressive. Distributed, no downtime, but the punishment is no rollback, which is a bit
Yep,
spooky, I would say. But I
yep,
guess that's why you have the QA team as well. Um,
yeah,
Backwards compatibility is required because of the incremental rollout. Then the protocol changes and the storage changes are probably the worst parts, because
yep.
you got to be super careful not to make
Yeah,
things. Or yeah, I guess this is really just a backwards compatibility concern. Um,
yeah, and the rollback is not possible. It's kind of an outcome of that. It's like it's the protocol and storage changes that made rollback like such a difficult problem to solve and one that we didn't really attempt to solve.
yeah, it's cool that you went with that strategy because, or yeah, I always plan on rolling back when it breaks. So
Yep.
pretty cool to just go for, oh, we're not going to do that. Oh, okay.
Yep.
Um, and they need to be on board with major upgrades. That's sort of interesting. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I guess sort of makes sense. Multiple versions need to be maintained at the same time, and I think the biggest thing that maybe I still don't understand from this process is it seems like a big piece of why things are this way is because there's this specific requirement for customers to have their own deployments. Is that correct?
Yes.
And
Yeah. So
you
that
can't
is
just have a hosted service.
Yeah, so that's a really important like thing to call out is so this was all like on premise. The customers are running it. NuaDB is moving towards like a more of a database as a service thing, and then of course from there's a lot of stuff will look the same internally, but will be hidden from the customer. So like all the testing and the upgrades, won't be rolled out to every customer at once, but will first be done in QA, then maybe a couple like dev environments, like a couple like dev accounts, like that kind of thing, and then only be rolled out to like major production accounts, like after it's had some burn-in time. But all the stuff I discussed was basically for like releasing to on-premise customers, where we were physically handing them a new binary to run, and that they would install that on their servers and run the new software rather than the old software. So we had no control over like
Wow.
their actual hardware.
Whoa, okay, so this was self-hosted.
Yes, yeah, this is all self-hosted. Um,
Whoa,
yeah,
wow. And I guess,
yeah.
yeah, why is that?
Um, I mean, so I think some of it is like just historical. Like I say, NuaDB is moving more into a database as a service option, but that wasn't like when it was kind of created. That was not really the case. Some of it though is also that like some of these institutions are pretty anti like running stuff in the cloud. Like they have either for regulation reasons or for business reasons, they have to run things on their own hardware in their own data centers, and so they might not feel comfortable or are not allowed to run like something in a hosted solution, something that's hosted like as a service.
Wow, that is fascinating. That's such a pain. Oh my gosh. Yeah, the fact that you had to
Yeah,
write it to them, that explains a lot more why you were like, the customer needs to be on board. It's because there needs to be someone to
yeah,
like take the package at the door.
yeah, exactly. And yeah, and we have minimal control over their environment. Like we hope that they're going to take it and run it on a QA environment first before running on production, but like we can't control that. We just like they have the newest version and they can choose what to do with it. And of course, we have sales engineers and stuff like working services, like working to help them be successful. But like at the end of the day, it's like they're the ones who control their hardware and they can do what they want. And so, yeah, we have to basically remove as many foot guns as possible so that way hopefully they're successful.
Wow, yeah, that is super annoying. Okay, I wanna shift gears a little bit, go a little more the qualitative side, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Um, I had one question about this the code review process.
Oh yeah.
I'm just wondering if you have any like reflection on how NuaDB was able to create this culture, this code review
Uh,
culture.
I think that's a good question, because it kind of existed when I came in. I think some of it was like some of the early hires who worked there, are just came from that culture, like are just kind of like the old timey, like like say mailing list kind of folks who like have been around the block and like have worked on kind of like long either open source or just like long development cycles, like systems stuff where like there's a lot of debate and a lot of discussion about anything that happens, and things will, like I say, bounce around a mailing list for a long time before the final patch is actually merged in. And so I think just like those, I don't know like who, if it was intentional hiring people like that, but just having people like that, I think enforced that culture. Like they were just people who have been doing that for years and brought that. And then as a result, everyone who came on board, like me, who was obviously much younger and with less prior experience, like just developed that. And I think a big part of it too is just that it's like no one wants to be solely responsible if like we lose data at a bank or something. So some of it's like a self-defense mechanism where like you really want people to rip your stuff apart because you want it to be like when it goes out, you want it to be like, okay, we collectively decided that this was okay. And at the same time, when you're reviewing someone else's stuff, you know that like if something slipped out, it would not just be blamed on that person. It would be like everyone would be responsible, and so you do an extra careful review because of that. So yeah, I think that kind of like fear of like messing up a customer made it so everyone like really wanted to collaboratively come up with like the best possible quality, so that way no one was individually like on the hook if there was a bug that made it into the wild.
Yeah, that makes sense that the stakes sort of enforce it to a certain degree.
Yeah.
Pretty interesting. Um, and then I guess I would say sort of at a high level, did you feel like empowered? Like this is a fair amount of process, I would say. This is like much higher than I would expect from sort of a small company, process-wise. Did you feel empowered to improve this process and make changes to it while you were at NuoDB?
Yeah, definitely. I don't think I had like a ton of like a ton of stuff I wanted to change, and maybe in part because like it was one of my like I did some internships, but it was like my first full-time position, and so I just kind of like grew up in that culture kind of as it were. But I do know we had some new hires who came in later who felt that the code review process, like especially, was like a little bit too like aggressive and nitpicky. Like they were kind of they were just kind of upset that when they would put out a review for like what they thought was a small fix, it would get 30 comments and spend a week in review, and they're like, this doesn't feel necessary. And so there was definitely discussion as a team about like kind of trying to like revise the kind of code review conduct that we had. So I guess yes and no. I think there was definitely room to like voice opinions, and like there was definitely room for discussion. I also don't think that it was super easy to actually like change the culture around some of this stuff. And yeah, so yeah, I don't know if that really answers it, but yeah, I never personally like tried to change anything super major, and so yeah, I don't have super good first-hand experience with that.
Yeah, I guess that leads nicely to my next question, last question actually, which is, did you feel responsible for improving it? Did you feel like, as a member of this process, that you had the responsibility to improve it?
Definitely. I mean, one thing that I think there was a lot of discussion about that I took in and definitely like saw and wanted to change was, I mean, I think it's a problem at all software companies, but we were pretty bad at estimations in terms of like when we would look at the initial backlog and like or wish list and like prioritize how long it was going to take. It usually ended up taking a lot longer than we thought it was going to take, and that was something that we spent a lot of time as a team talking about why that was and how to fix it. I think a lot of it was just that the system was really complex, and like when it was first founded, some of the stuff that kind of the pieces were not as well isolated as they should. So you just had to like take a lot of different components of the system into account when you were like coming up with the design, and it was easy to until you thought about it really hard, it was easy to like not think of something. But that was definitely something that like I felt responsibility for and like motivation to work on, and I know everyone else did. It was unfortunately a hard thing to make like easy progress on, because some of it is just like getting a stronger foundation, which is not easy to do. But that was definitely something I was like involved with. Yeah.
Awesome.
I
Yeah,
don't
so
know.
that's all my
Yeah.
questions. But I wanted to thank you a ton for taking this time for me.
Yeah. That was super fun to talk through.